"You kissed the wrong guy," the mafia boss said, his voice low and cold as steel. I froze. The entire bar fell silent. The man I had just accidentally kissed in the dark corner wasn't the charming bartender I liked, but Damian Moretti, the infamous mafia king of New York. His eyes stripped me bare in front of everyone. "And that mistake," he murmured, tilting his head slightly, "will cost you." The taste of alcohol still lingered on my lips. My heart pounded like a war drum, shame, fear, and confusion crashing all at once. Why was he looking at me as if I were the secret he'd been hunting all along? My name is Sienna Brooks, a mural artist. And that night I kissed the wrong man, the mafia boss. I can still feel the way the air shifted in that room, heavy with expensive cologne, and whispered power right after his words landed. It was a masquerade party. You know, one of those ridiculously lavish things Clara, my friend, always somehow drags me to, and I only went because she promised they had good champagne and a chance to network for my art. I was wearing this cheap mask and a borrowed dress that felt too tight, and honestly, I was probably having one too many glasses of that free bubbly, because I felt so out of place, like a piece of cheap wallpaper peeling off a marble wall. I'd been watching Eli, the guy I thought I'd kissed, the one with the kind eyes and the easy smile who always worked the main bar for half the night, trying to work up the nerve to talk to him, to say something halfway intelligent about the way the light caught the bottles behind the counter, or maybe just compliment his shirt. When I got shoved hard from behind into that dark, heavy velvet curtain near the back, my mask slipped, catching on my hair, and I just latched onto the first solid warm thing I found, which turned out to be a very expensive suit, and a pair of lips that didn't taste like the light, easy kind of kiss I was expecting from Eli at all. It was deep, urgent, possessive, and electric feeling, like a secret being exchanged in the shadows. And before I could even pull away and mumble an apology for my drunken clumsiness, Damian Moretti pulled back the curtain with a decisive snap, revealing us me with my lipstick smudged, and my cheap mask dangling to the entire assembly of people who looked like they were born wearing diamonds and judging everyone else. My mind was scrambling, trying desperately to put together the sharp, dangerous feeling of that powerful kiss with the cold, measured anger in his eyes. And all I could register was the silence, a silence so complete you could hear the faint rhythmic tick of the antique grandfather clock in the corner, a massive sound that suddenly felt like the countdown to my own personal public disaster. It's crazy how quickly your world can shrink down to just the space between you and one terrifying person, especially when that person holds so much weight in the city. I remember trying to breathe, but the air felt too thick and heavy, like trying to inhale underwater, or breathing through a wet cloth, and my hands were shaking so hard against the strap of the flimsy little beaded purse I was holding, just to keep from completely falling over, and making the scene even worse than it already was. All those impeccably dressed men and women, the ones who usually glide past me without a second glance because I wear paint under my nails, and my entire life fits into a studio apartment the size of their wine cellar. They were all staring now, not with simple curiosity, but with a kind of predatory, gleeful amusement, like spectators waiting for the execution. I was the fool who, completely oblivious, stumbled into the lion's cage and managed to annoy the lion, and they were ready for the full, humiliating show. Damian, Mr. Moretti. He didn't move much at all for a long moment, which was maybe the scariest and most defining thing about him. He just stood there, letting his simple, chilling sentence hang in the air, allowing the fear and the judgment to ripple out and collect on me like morning dew on cheap fabric. He took a slow, deliberate step back, adjusting the heavy gold cufflink on his sleeve, a cufflink that looked expensive and heavy enough to be used as a weapon. And I caught a quick, fleeting expression on his face that wasn't outright fury exactly, but something close to genuine surprise, like he was the one who was startled by the unexpected interruption before he locked the cold mask back in place. I wanted to just disintegrate, to disappear into the floor, to become utterly invisible, but I knew I couldn't run. That would only confirm what they all thought, that I was some kind of stupid, clumsy liability who couldn't handle the consequences of a simple drunken mistake. I had to stand my ground and face him, even though every single nerve ending I had was screaming at me to turn and bolt out the door and back to the safe, messy anonymity of my own life, which suddenly felt a million miles away. I know how easy it is to feel completely small and insignificant when you're standing in front of something so powerful and overwhelming when you feel like you've been judged and dismissed your whole life just because of your background or your clothes. I get that feeling deep down. But before we dive deeper into what happened next, that precise moment when my whole life changed because of a single reckless choice, I just need to ask you one quick favor. If you're connecting with this story, if you've ever felt like you didn't belong or like you were constantly overlooked, would you take just a second to open your phone right now, please? Just take a moment to like the video, leave a quick comment below. Maybe tell me where in the world you're watching from. I'd really love to know, and hit that subscribe button to join this community. It honestly means the world to me, and it helps me share more of these messy, true moments from my life. Thank you, truly. Okay, back to the mess, because the mess was about to get a whole lot darker and more complicated. The next morning, the hangover wasn't just a physical pain, it was a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread that followed me from the moment I woke up, with the vivid, horrifying memory of his cold, assessing eyes. I got a call early from one of the bouncers at the bar, a mountain of a man named Enzo, who only ever grunted at me before, and his voice on the phone was all business, flat immediate and completely humorless. "Mr. Moretti wants to see you. Now. Don't be late. And don't wear that ridiculous dress." There was no negotiation, no suggestion, just an order delivered with the absolute chilling understanding that you simply do not disobey Damian Moretti. I pulled on the cleanest jeans I owned and a simple, nondescript black turtleneck, trying desperately to look as professional, humble, and insignificant as possible, hoping that if I just looked like a blank slate, he would assess the damage, demand some ridiculous payment for dry cleaning a ruined shirt, or paying off a small debt for a tarnished reputation, and then finally let me go back to my quiet, messy art life. Walking back into the Velvet Blade, which is what they called the bar, felt utterly different in the harsh daylight. It wasn't a party scene anymore. It was a cathedral of silent, looming power, all dark wood and intimidating silence, and every shadow felt like it was hiding a secret. The few men who were there polishing glasses or wiping down the already spotless bar with meticulous, nervous care, they paused their work and looked at me, and I could feel the silent, collective judgment, the kind that says, "Here's the little mouse who thinks she can wander off the streets and play with the cat, and now she's here to beg." Damian was sitting at a private table in the very back corner, the kind that was always reserved and hidden by a partial screen. But today, the screen was conspicuously pulled back, as if he wanted everyone in the entire room to witness my shame and this humiliating meeting. Eli, the bartender I had actually wanted to kiss, was standing near the main bar, and when our eyes met for a brief second, his usual easy warmth was completely gone, replaced by a cold, almost disgusted hostility, and he quickly looked away, wiping furiously and obsessively at a spotlessly clean section of the counter, pretending I didn't exist. Damian didn't look up right away. He was reading something on a small electronic tablet, the soft glow illuminating the sharp angles of his face. But I knew with a certainty that chilled me that he was intensely aware of every breath I took, every shaky, reluctant step I made toward his table. When he finally did lift his eyes, it wasn't a look of aggression, but a look of cool, detached assessment, like he was deciding if I was even worth the minimal effort it would take to crush me, which somehow felt far worse than an outright scream of rage. I remember swallowing hard, the dryness in my throat, making it nearly impossible to speak, and I managed to get out a trembling, desperate apology. "Mr. Moretti, I am so truly sorry. It was a complete drunken mistake. I thought you were someone else entirely, and I will do absolutely anything, pay for anything, just to make this right and disappear." That was the signal for the collective low laughter to start, a few suppressed chuckles from the guys near the bar, and one of them, a slick-haired lieutenant leaning against a pillar, made sure his voice carried clearly across the room as he stage whispered, "She kissed the mafia boss without even knowing who he was. Bless her little oblivious heart. She thinks this is a broken vase, not a life sentence." That was the first wave of true, crushing humiliation, the knowledge that I was nothing more than a ridiculous joke, a silly, clumsy distraction in their deadly serious, high-stakes world. I could feel the intense heat rising in my face, a burning shame that had nothing to do with the physical kiss, and everything to do with being instantly and universally dismissed as nothing, as some foolish, ignorant girl who couldn't even keep her crushes straight. I stood there rooted to the spot, feeling the cheap fabric of my turtleneck clinging uncomfortably to my back, with nervous sweat, just waiting for Damien to deliver the final blow, the insult, or the deadly threat that would finally mercifully end this nightmare. But he didn't deliver the expected violence. He set the tablet down slowly, deliberately, his movements quiet, but incredibly heavy, and leaned back in his expensive chair, folding his impeccably tailored hands over his knee. And for the first time I noticed the precise, smooth flow of his suit, the way it moved with him, like a second protective skin. He didn't raise his voice. In fact, he lowered it even further, making me strain to hear him over the frantic pounding in my own ears, and I realized he wasn't trying to punish me right now. He was simply taking absolute control of my entire existence, in the most quiet, absolute, and terrifying way imaginable, asserting his dominion without ever raising his voice. "An apology is not what I require, Miss Brooks," he finally said, and hearing him speak my full name so calmly and precisely sent a fresh, terrifying shiver right down my spine. "You think this is about a drunken, clumsy kiss? That's what amateurs and petty thieves worry about? I deal with things far more significant than lipstick stains." He gestured slightly toward the door, a dismissive flick of his wrist that somehow managed to indicate the entire world outside the bar, and a flicker of something maybe cold amusement, or perhaps weary frustration crossed his face. "You came here to apologize and leave quietly, thinking you could simply erase your presence. That's not happening in my world." He then pulled a small, pristine white card from his inner jacket pocket and slid it across the dark wood table toward me. It was thick, heavy stock, completely blank, except for a tiny, elegant, embossed letter M in the corner. "You are now on my special protection list. Consider it a debt incurred. You don't leave my orbit, you don't talk to the police, and you don't disappear until the debt is paid not just to me but to my organization." The silence that followed his declaration was different now, heavier. It wasn't amusement I sensed from his men, but genuine curiosity and a growing, palpable unease, because putting me on that list was a major, unpredictable move, and I saw Eli's head snap up from the bar, his eyes wide and shocked, looking less hostile toward me, and more deeply, profoundly terrified for both of us. The idea of being on a special protection list sounded utterly ridiculous, like some dramatic cliché out of a bad spy movie, but the cold, non-negotiable way Damien delivered the phrase made it sound exactly like a death sentence, or at least a lifetime of servitude. It wasn't protection. It was absolute ownership, a heavy, expensive leash placed around my neck without my permission. And now everyone in that room, and soon the entire underworld, would know I belonged to him for better or worse. I finally managed to look at Eli again, the man who was no longer pretending to clean glasses, but was now just staring intensely at me. And he shook his head almost imperceptibly, a quick, sharp, fearful movement that was definitely meant to be a final, desperate warning. Later that day, Eli actually sought me out again, catching me just as I was leaving the little coffee shop, where I usually grab a cheap pastry, and this time, he grabbed my arm with a desperate, painful intensity that was nothing like the charming bartender persona he usually wore. "Get out of here, Sienna, now. Leave the city." He hissed, his face tight with tension and fear, his voice low and urgent, vibrating with genuine terror. "You have no idea what you just did or what that list means. No one gets on Moretti's list by accident, and no one escapes him ever. He's not the charming, romantic owner he pretends to be. He's a cold, calculating machine, and you just got caught in the gears. He'll use you up until you're nothing." He dropped my arm, leaving faint, burning red marks on my skin, and quickly disappeared back into the busy city crowd before I could even process the words, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding, the terrible, heavy weight of Damien's control already settling over me, and the horrifying realization that my single drunken mistake had just irrevocably turned my humble life into a very dangerous, inescapable game I didn't know how to play. The next few days blurred into weeks of paralyzing paranoia and a frantic, nervous energy that made it virtually impossible to focus on my art, the one thing that usually anchored me. I constantly checked my apartment door, double-bolting it, nervously looking over my shoulder on the subway, convinced that every stranger wearing a dark suit or carrying a newspaper was one of Damien's silent men, following me, watching me, waiting for the signal. But the true stomach-dropping terror came a few nights later, when I was trying to sketch out a new mural idea on my drawing tablet, trying to distract myself with a difficult, detailed design. The screen was acting funny, glitching, subtly flickering with a strange, repeated pattern. And I'm not a tech genius by any means, but something felt fundamentally off, an unsettling coldness in the air. I called Clara, my best friend, the journalist who deals with surveillance and shady sources all the time, and asked her to swing by under the guise of helping me prep for a new commission, and I just mentioned the weird tablet flicker, hoping she'd just wave it off as a power surge. Clara arrived, and she's one of those people who moves through the world with a clipboard and a permanent expression of focused professional suspicion. And she didn't just look at the tablet. She looked at the entire apartment, my tiny, cluttered, deeply private sanctuary, where I thought I was absolutely safe and alone. She found them almost instantly using a small specialized device, 2 tiny lenses expertly hidden, one cunningly tucked behind a cheap framed print I'd bought years ago, another seamlessly integrated into the smoke detector on the ceiling, right above my bed. My lungs emptied instantly. I couldn't breathe, couldn't gasp, couldn't scream. There were hidden live feed cameras in my apartment, broadcasting my entire mundane, intimate existence to some surveillance room I couldn't even begin to imagine. And the profound, absolute violation of that knowledge made me feel physically ill, like my soul had been stripped bare and was now being coldly inspected. Clara, being the professional she is, didn't panic. She just went completely still, her eyes like chips of blue ice, her face hard with controlled fury, and she gave me this look that told me everything I needed to know about the depth of the trouble I was in, that this was not a joke, and it was certainly not about a broken heart. She methodically taped over the lenses with thick black tape, telling me in a low, urgent voice to act completely normal, to pretend I hadn't found them, because showing I knew was worse than them watching me in secret. That night the fear was absolutely paralyzing, lying awake in my own bed in the dark, feeling his invisible judging eyes watching me, listening to every sigh and every movement, judging the complete insignificance of my quiet life. And I felt utterly violated, ashamed, and trapped. The next day, I found myself back at the Velvet Blade, not because I was summoned, but because the need to look him in the eye and demand an explanation, to feel like I had some small, tiny piece of control back, was overwhelming. Damien was waiting, as if he expected my furious return, and he didn't even pretend to be surprised when I slammed the taped-over broken smoke detector onto his enormous polished desk. "The cameras, Damien, why? What in the hell are you looking for? I'm nobody. I'm just a painter. I live on cheap takeout food and caffeine. What possible secret could you want from my life?" I demanded, my voice raw and shaky, but filled with the pure, desperate fury of a cornered animal fighting for its last inch of dignity. He leaned back, completely unruffled by my emotional, desperate outburst, and that's when he hit me with the truth, delivered with the same cold, precise tone he uses to order a rare steak or authorize a major operation. "I told you, Miss Brooks, I don't believe in coincidences in my world," he stated, tapping a long, perfectly manicured finger on the corner of the desk. "People who suddenly get close to me always have an agenda. They want money, they want power, or they want the opportunity to put a bullet in my head. You, a woman I'd never encountered who has no business being at that kind of party, get drunk and happen to latch onto me specifically. It looks precisely like a setup, a planned distraction." His gaze intensified, turning sharp and analytical, piercing through my fear and anger. "If someone makes a move like that, if someone kisses me, I need to know why." He paused, letting the silence build again. But this time, the silence felt like the prelude to a terrifying revelation, not just a threat. He then smiled, a slow, humorless, and genuinely terrifying curve of his lips that didn't reach his eyes at all, and he picked up his tablet again, turning the screen slightly so I could see the video feed. It was a grainy, time-stamped surveillance video of Eli, the charming bartender, the man I had a crush on, quietly accepting a heavy, suspicious envelope from a known rival of Damien's, a ruthless, well-documented weapons dealer, in a dimly lit industrial warehouse on the waterfront. "Your clumsy, drunken, entirely accidental kiss," Damien stated, his voice suddenly hard and final, stripped of all pretense. "It led me directly to the traitor in my bar, Eli. I was watching the cameras I already had on the main floor replaying the sequence right after you kissed me, trying to figure out if your move was some elaborate distraction. And instead I watched Eli's face while you were kissing me. He cracked. He gave himself away with a single look of horrified panic. Your mistake was the alarm bell I desperately needed to hear. I stood there feeling the wind completely knocked out of my sails, realizing the full, terrifying scope of his machinations. I wasn't a victim, not exactly, and I wasn't just a fool either. I was an unintentional catalyst, a piece of unknowing, irrelevant bait that had somehow flushed out a snake hiding in plain sight in his closest circle. My clumsy, impulsive crush on a bartender had somehow become the highly improbable, crucial key to unlocking a plot against the city's most powerful mafia boss, and that twist of terrifying fate was completely dizzying, leaving me feeling like I was spinning out of control. Damien didn't apologize for the cameras. He simply justified them with a ruthless logic that was terrifyingly sound. Everything in his world is about continuous risk assessment, and I was just another variable he needed to control and neutralize. He saw my shock, my quiet horror, and he didn't offer comfort, just a chilling confirmation of my new unwanted reality. The protection list stays, he informed me, looking down at his tablet again, clearly finished with the conversation and dismissing my emotional turmoil. You're still useful, Miss Brooks. You witnessed a betrayal and you exposed a weakness. And in this life, usefulness is the only absolute thing that guarantees survival, especially yours. I left that day feeling like a pawn on a giant, terrifying chessboard, moved by an invisible, powerful, and utterly ruthless hand. And the knowledge that the man I had liked was a traitor was almost as painful as the fact that the man I feared now owned every moment of my private life, and my reaction had been instrumental in exposing the entire plot. The sense of being a helpless pawn only intensified in the grueling weeks that followed, and the air around me felt perpetually thin and cold, like I was moving underwater, struggling for breath. I tried to focus fiercely on my painting, the only place I ever felt truly independent and in control, but even the canvas felt like it was watching me, judging my new reality. And then the inevitable, terrifying shoe dropped. Eli, the traitor and weapons dealer, the man who had warned me to run, the one who was secretly plotting against Damien. He made his final desperate move and kidnapped me. It wasn't dramatic. No squealing tires or car chase or shootout. I was just walking home late from the studio one night, my mind foggy with exhaustion and fear, and a heavy chemical-smelling hand clapped over my mouth, pulling me instantly and brutally into the darkened alley between two closed shops. And the next thing I knew, I was blindfolded, gagged, and violently shoved into the back of a fast-moving van. When the blindfold finally came off, I was in a sterile, windowless concrete room, tied painfully to a metal chair, with thick, uncomfortable rope. And Eli was standing in front of me no longer, the charming, gentle bartender, but a hard, calculating man whose face was twisted with hatred and a dangerous, manic desperation, with a heavy-caliber gun tucked casually into the waistband of his trousers. Damien only sees you as a tool, Sienna. Eli sneered, circling me slowly, deliberately, like a predator toying with its meal. You really think that pathetic kiss meant something, that he cares one damn bit about your pretty little paintbrushes or your pathetic life? You're a means to an end, the most disposable kind of asset. You were bait, pure and simple, and you were useful to him, so he kept you on a leash. He then pulled out his own phone, which looked cheap and disposable, and showed me a video, a grainy, low-quality clip of Damien in a dark office talking to one of his senior men, and the cold, flat tone of Damien's voice in the recording cut me to the core, completely shattering the last tiny, fragile seed of hope I might have planted about his motives or his underlying decency. Keep her close. Damien was ordering, his voice detached and utterly void of warmth or emotion. Keep her close until she's useful. She is not to be harmed in any way, but she is also not to be allowed to leave the city. She is our insurance policy. Eli paused the video and grinned, a genuine, malicious, and ugly smile that contorted his face. See, keep her close until she's useful. You were never anything more than a glorified asset on a logistics spreadsheet, Sienna. You were his shield, a piece of human collateral, not his woman, and you certainly weren't special. Hearing those words, seeing that devastating video, was a humiliation far deeper and more destructive than the public mockery in the bar. That first humiliation had been about embarrassment and social shame. This one was about heartbreak, the shattering of my already fragile self-worth, and the brutal realization that I had been foolish enough to let my mind even entertain the slightest possibility that the most dangerous man in the city might have seen something genuine or worthy of respect in me. I felt like a child who had reached for a pretty glittering toy, only to find it was a lethal, agonizing trap, and the despair was overwhelming, suffocating. I didn't scream or beg. I simply went silent, the quiet dignity my mother always told me to hold on to in hard times being the only thing I had left to protect. My spine straightened slightly against the hard back of the metal chair, an action that spoke volumes of my silent refusal to completely break before him. When the rumors started spreading in the underworld about my kidnapping and capture, they were vicious, painting me as a hapless idiot, a vulnerable target, a symbol of Damien's carelessness. The little painter made Moretti show weakness. They whispered, suggesting that my presence, my continued existence, was a liability he couldn't afford to keep. Eli, after interrogating me intensely about Damien's movements and operations and realizing I genuinely knew absolutely nothing of importance about the logistics, eventually gave up and let me go, throwing me violently out of a car late at night onto a dark, muddy, unfamiliar street. But not before delivering one last gut-wrenching insult that showed me exactly where I stood in their hierarchy of life and death. When I finally managed to find my way back to my apartment, completely shaken, covered in dust scrapes and mud, 2 of Damien's enormous men were waiting outside the building, their faces grim, unreadable, and deeply annoyed. They didn't offer comfort or check if I was hurt. They looked at me with open, undisguised contempt for being an unnecessary complication. One of them, a big guy with a distinctive jagged scar across his jaw, pushed me toward the door, not gently but firmly, like I was a heavy, inconvenient piece of luggage, and he spat the words out as he unlocked my apartment for me. The low, dismissive voice rubbing salt into my emotional wounds. "Boss said you can't die yet, not your time." Consider yourself lucky that he needed Eli alive for a few more hours to gather intel, because if Eli had harmed you, you'd just be collateral damage and he would have just ordered a cleaning crew. "Now go inside and don't leave the apartment again. You're still on the clock, Miss Brooks, and you are not allowed to be weak." That was the moment I fully understood my place. I was a living bargaining chip used and discarded by Eli, then recovered and guarded by Damien, valued by neither for my personhood, just a minor asset in a war that had nothing to do with me. I was disposable but inconveniently alive, and the shame of that cold, objective reality was the heaviest burden I had ever carried. My spirit felt completely broken, utterly crushed by the weight of being nothing more than a strategic piece in a deadly game of power and betrayal, and I wanted nothing more than to just disappear and completely erase the moment I walked into that bar and stumbled onto Damien Moretti's complicated life. I was at my lowest, most cynical point, spending my days huddled and isolated in my studio, barely eating, just staring blankly at blank canvases, the original fear having curdled into a cold, dull, and pervasive resentment when Clara came back, not just as my friend, but as the investigative journalist who had just stumbled onto a story far too big and terrifying to ignore. She didn't offer an apology for dragging me into the upscale world that had nearly gotten me killed. She simply sat down in the middle of my paint-splattered floor, her briefcase open on the ground, and laid out a series of blurry surveillance photos and heavily redacted documents. "Sienna, that kiss." She started, her voice hushed with urgency, her professional demeanor shaken by what she knew. It wasn't just a mistake, and it wasn't just a coincidence either. It literally saved his life. "I have the files." My eyes narrowed instantly, confusion, battling intensely with the cynicism that had become my constant companion. She explained with careful journalistic precision that the night of the masquerade, one of Eli's co-conspirators, a highly paid professional sniper, who was also a known arms trafficker, was set up on a high rooftop directly across from the Velvet Blade, aiming for Damien, who was seated at his usual partially obscured table in the back. The precise drunken moment you kissed him, you pulled his head forward and down slightly. She explained, pointing to an extremely grainy thermal photo with an enlarged circle around the back of Damien's head. The sniper's high-velocity bullet, it didn't hit him in the skull or the spine. It grazed his shoulder. It was a clean miss only because of the precise 1-second accidental movement your body caused when you latched onto him. The shock of that profound revelation hit me like a physical punch, draining the last vestiges of my cynical protective defenses and leaving me gasping for air. The reckless, drunken, horrifying act I'd spent weeks agonizing over the source of all my subsequent humiliation and fear was actually an unconscious, miraculous rescue. What I had thought was a moment of utter foolish impulsivity was in fact an absolute intervention of fate or destiny, or whatever cosmic force determines these things. I could only stare numbly at the photo, the image of that powerful, cold man leaning toward me in the dark, and suddenly the chilling lines he'd spoken, "I don't believe in coincidences," took on an entirely new, terrifying meaning, confirming that he was far more aware of the danger he lived in than I could ever comprehend. He hadn't kept me close because I was the cause of a threat. He kept me close guarded and under surveillance because I was the impossible, improbable reason. He was still drawing breath. The only thing that made him pause and actively question the brutal, logical rules of his dark world. I could see the sharp lines of his body, the way he held himself in a new light, suddenly realizing that he wasn't just dangerous to others, but constantly, irrevocably in danger himself, walking a tightrope, where a single clumsy kiss could literally mean the difference between life and immediate violent death. A few days after Clara's visit, after I had processed the full, terrifying implications of her discovery, Damien came to see me at my studio unannounced alone, and without the usual parade of intimidating bodyguards, which was an act of profound vulnerability that terrified me almost as much as his raw power did. He walked in, took a slow, deliberate survey of the chaotic, paint-splattered space, the complete opposite of his pristine, ordered world, and stood silently by my easel, his posture suggesting a man who wasn't used to standing still or exposed for very long. "Clara told you the truth," he stated flatly, not as a question designed to confirm, but as a confirmation of a truth he already knew. I possessed his voice softer and heavier than I'd ever heard it. I knotted my throat too tight and choked with emotion to speak the unbearable weight of his survival, now sitting heavy on my shoulders. "I never believed in fate, Sienna," he admitted, looking at the half-finished, struggling mural I was working on, his eyes distant, focused on something far away. "My life is built entirely on calculation, predictability, and consequence. You are the only variable I couldn't calculate, and you made me question everything I built. You're the anomaly." He then looked directly at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of genuine unmasked emotion in his eyes, a depth of gratitude, confusion, and reluctant tenderness that made him look suddenly vulnerable, almost agonizingly human. "I owe you my life, Sienna Brooks, and unlike every other debt in this world, I don't owe favors I can't properly repay, not even to myself." That moment marked a subtle, terrifying, and irrevocable shift in our dynamic, moving from cold ownership to a complicated, suffocating, and impossible debt that went far beyond money or even control. He started teaching me self-defense with an intense, surgical focus, showing up unexpectedly at my studio, not to threaten me but to show me how to hold my body, how to anticipate a blow from behind, how to use my slight frame to my advantage with leverage. And the lessons were intense, possessive, and oddly intimate, blurring the lines between threat and care. His hands, which were always cold and precise, would be on my arms, correcting my stance. His breath warm and minty against my neck as he whispered urgent instructions about momentum and footwork and the physical proximity. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed intensely with the sweat and dust of my working studio was intoxicating, frightening, and completely overwhelming all at once. "If anyone, and I mean anyone, touches you again," he warned, his voice low and guttural, after one particularly difficult lesson, where he had to physically subdue me to teach me a brutal lesson about leverage. "They die, Sienna. They don't just die because they touched my property. They die because they touched something that is not allowed to break or to be used. I won't allow it." I found myself hopelessly trapped, completely confused, between the paralyzing fear of his absolute control and the undeniable scorching desire that ignited whenever he was near, a chaotic, agonizing mix of revulsion and attraction that made me despise myself, yet rendered me utterly unable to walk away from the man whose life I had inadvertently saved, a life now inextricably and fatally linked to mine, tethered forever by a single accidental kiss. The complexity of our relationship, the intense secret late-night training sessions, contrasted brutally with the public pretense of my insignificance and worthlessness, was a dangerous, volatile secret, and the underworld which feeds on gossip, weakness, and rumor quickly sniffed out the scent of trouble and a growing obsession. Eli, who was still managing to run his operations and trying desperately to bring down Damien from the shadows, started spreading the most toxic, insidious rumors, branding me everywhere as Damien's new mistress, a woman he had planted to investigate his rivals, a creature of his own, making a spy now operating in plain sight. The other mafia factions, always looking for a weakness to exploit in the hierarchy, immediately bought into the lie and branded me an untrustworthy spy and a liability. And suddenly the fear on the streets wasn't just about avoiding Damien, but about avoiding every single ruthless faction who now saw me as a target, a loose end to be tied up violently. The pressure on my daily life became unbearable. I was getting veiled threats left on my answering machine. My paint supplies were vandalized and destroyed, and the few commissions I had started completely drying up instantly because no one wanted their project associated with Damien Moretti's alleged spy mistress and the danger she represented. To protect me from the full weight of that organized danger, Damien made a cruel, calculated, and necessary move that felt to me at the time like the final definitive betrayal. He publicly and categorically denied knowing me at all, orchestrating a painful scene at a high-profile charity fundraiser where I was working waiting tables for a catering gig, desperately trying to make some clean money to survive. And when one of the local gossiping crime writers cornered him and asked pointedly about the new little painter, supposedly on his arm, Damien's cold eyes passed right over me, colder than ice, and he stated loudly with an air of complete dismissive disdain that the entire room heard, "I have no idea who that woman is. I don't associate with temporary catering staff. She must be sadly confused or perhaps desperate for attention." The humiliation was instantaneous, complete, and crushing, the silence returning. But this time it was laced with sickening pity and smug, superior satisfaction from the other wealthy guests, who finally had confirmation that I was just a desperate, ridiculous nobody who had chased a powerful man and been tossed aside like spoiled trash. I misunderstood completely, of course, the pain of his public rejection slicing through me deeper than any knife or bullet, feeling like my heart was being torn from my chest, and in my despair, fury, and agonizing sense of betrayal, I poured every ounce of my raw, wounded emotion into the only language I truly knew, my art, the only thing that felt honest. I painted a giant, furious mural on the side of a deserted warehouse wall near the docks, an enormous, visceral piece done in dark, angry, clashing colors, a devastating portrait of a man with eyes of flame and shadow, his mouth curved in a mocking, predatory smile that revealed nothing, and a single deliberate dark red kiss mark staining his sharp collar, and I titled it with agonizing clarity and self-pity, "The Devil Who Kisses." The mural went viral, almost immediately picked up by local news blogs and social media accounts, where I was mercilessly mocked in the comments as the crazy ex-mistress, the desperate, pathetic artist trying to get back at the man who broke her heart, and the painting itself became a cruel public symbol of my complete shaming. I never saw Damien there during the day, but one cold, rainy night, when I was standing across the street from my own creation, just staring at my own pain, made visible, feeling the shame wash over me again. I noticed a sleek black car idling silently down the block, its lights off. I didn't see him get out, but I knew he was there watching the mural, watching my raw, broken, agonizing portrait of him. And I saw a flicker of movement in the reflection of the rain-slicked window, an arm resting heavily on the door, a hand rising slowly to shield a profile from the relentless rain, and I caught a brief glimpse of his face in the glass. The expression in the reflection wasn't anger at the public exposure or even the cold indifference I was used to. It was a devastating mix of exhaustion, pain, and silent, deep acknowledgement, a look that told me he understood the true crushing pain he had caused, and that he was enduring his own version of it too, which only deepened the agonizing, impossible complexity of my love for the monster he was forced to be. The true understanding of why he had betrayed me publicly, why he had endured the mockery that was now destroying my fledgling art career, came to me in two final dizzying pieces that shattered my reality. First, Clara. My best friend finally dropped her own, far more terrifying and personal bomb on me, unable to carry the secret any longer. We were sitting in my studio surrounded by the shadows of my unfinished angry work, and she confessed, her voice thick with emotion and guilt, that she wasn't just an investigative crime journalist. She was an embedded FBI informant, and she had been using me, my accidental connection to Damien, to get closer to him and his inner circle. Before I could fully process the catastrophic depth of her betrayal, she quickly explained the reality that had been hidden from everyone, even me. Damien isn't the monster they say, Sienna. Not anymore, not completely. He's been actively dismantling his own criminal empire from the inside. He's the mole, the high-level asset, the one the FBI is actually protecting right now. She tearfully explained that the charming bartender covered the protection list, the surveillance cameras, the public denial it wasn't to seduce or use me for typical mafia plots. It was all a devastating, complex cover to find the traitors who were perpetuating the most horrific parts of his inherited legacy, specifically the massive human trafficking ring he had inherited and desperately wanted to destroy, without exposing his people to the immediate fatal retaliation of the larger interconnected syndicates. Damien was conducting a brutal, dangerous internal cleanup, playing the cold, ruthless boss perfectly, to flush out the worst, most vicious elements and bring down the whole rotten structure brick by agonizing reputation, destroying brick. The second, final, and most profound part of the truth came to me one stormy, violent night when the city was being lashed by a torrential downpour that shook the glass violently in my studio windows. I had been restless, the crushing revelations about Damien and Clara making me unable to stay still, and I impulsively drove down to the old derelict warehouse district, near a property I knew he secretly owned and rarely visited. I wasn't looking for him, just trying desperately to feel closer to the difficult, complex truth. And that's when I saw the flickering light and the plume of thick, acrid smoke rising against the dark, storm-swept sky. Peeking cautiously around the corner of a massive derelict building, I saw Damien soaked completely to the bone, his expensive suit clinging heavily to his frame, standing motionlessly in front of a giant steel-reinforced vault door that was now hanging open, its complicated insides completely engulfed in a slow, controlled, and deliberate fire. He wasn't burning paper money or gold. He was burning digital documents, ledgers, and hard drives. But what stopped my breath and shattered every remaining piece of my prejudice and cynicism was the sight of several pale, terrified people, mostly young women, and a few frightened children being quietly, gently ushered out of a side entrance by two of Damien's most intimidating-looking, scar-faced men who were treating them with an unsettling, profound gentleness, wrapping them tenderly in blankets, and loading them into unmarked civilian vans, driven by people who were definitely not his usual crew. That was the pivotal moment. I saw him not as the devil, but as the executioner of the devil's work, a monster sacrificing his own power and reputation to save the completely innocent. I moved silently through the deep shadows, drawn forward by an overwhelming magnetic need to be close to this complex truth, and I whispered the words barely audible over the roar of the rain and the fire. "You're not the devil they think you are at all." He turned slowly, his face streaked with soot rain and exhaustion, his eyes catching the dangerous orange glow of the fire, and he looked at me completely unguarded, utterly exhausted, and fundamentally heartbreakingly good beneath the armor, and his voice was a raw, aching whisper, heavy with years of unspoken guilt and profound pain. "And you're not the mistake I thought you were, Sienna. You were the only honest, unexpected thing in this whole rotten life I was living. The realization that Damien was destroying his empire from within, that the man I loved was secretly a force for agonizing, complicated redemption, should have brought me some peace and a measure of vindication. But it only led to the final, deepest level of public shame and personal cost. Once the FBI and the police got wind of the full, complex scope of Damien's internal operation, and realized I was the only person with both the physical connection to him and the non-official knowledge of his secret actions, they descended on me like a swarm of angry bees. They forced me into relentless interrogation rooms, tried every psychological trick to bully me, and eventually offered me full, generous immunity if I would just testify against him, against the image of the mafia boss they thought he was, to bring down the whole structure in one devastating public swoop. when I refused repeatedly, steadfastly, and vehemently refusing to betray the man who had risked everything, including his own life, for a chance at redemption, the accusations turned ugly, hitting me exactly where I was most vulnerable, my character and my heart. "You're in love with a murderer, Miss Brooks." A furious, defeated lead detective spat at me across a gray metal table, his words designed to wound and humiliate me completely. I refused to even answer, just stared straight ahead at the wall, knowing that my steadfast silence was the only thing I had left that was truly mine and untainted by their manipulations. But the police and the FBI weren't the only ones watching. The press, always hungry for scandal and devastation, had an absolute field day with my refusal. Papers published the grainy surveillance photos from the night of the accidental kiss, right alongside the viral mockery of my public mural, splashing vile headlines across the front pages. "The painter who kissed the devil artist refuses to betray mafia lover and alleged human trafficker." Suddenly, I wasn't just a minor figure in a complex crime plot. I was a symbol of shame, a woman condemned by society for choosing loyalty and love for the wrong kind of man, a mafia boss trying to repent, which was worse in their eyes than a simple monster. My mother, who had always struggled deeply to understand my messy life as an artist, and my inability to just settle down, called me her voice, cold flat, and devoid of all maternal warmth, and essentially disowned me, saying I had forever disgraced the family name by associating with a murderer and a criminal. My few remaining friends vanished instantly, unable or unwilling to deal with the intense scrutiny and the dangerous association, and I was left utterly and completely alone, condemned by everyone I knew for choosing loyalty and a cursed love. Then Damien disappeared completely. He didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a detailed note explaining where he was going, or what the long-term plan was, just vanished into the wind, leaving only a single folded piece of thick white paper tucked under a paint tube in my studio. It had only 4 powerful words written in his strong, precise, familiar hand. "Love me in silence." The world had taken everything from me, my career, my family, my reputation, my peace, and all I had left was the heavy, sacred, cursed love for a man trying to repent, a love I was now forced to carry in absolute secrecy, like a hidden burning ember. A quiet, slow year passed, a period spent painfully rebuilding a life from the absolute ashes of public condemnation, gossip, and shame. I took every penny I had earned from my past work, and every small bit of money I could scrape together from small anonymous commissions far outside the city limits, and I opened a small cafe, a tiny place with warm, soft lighting, and the intoxicating scent of good coffee and freshly baked goods. I designed the interior entirely in dark mahogany wood and heavy, comfortable velvet, with intimate, slightly hidden corners, and a magnificent dark granite bar, making it an exact, almost painful echo of the Velvet Blade, the bar where my life was simultaneously ruined and completely reborn. It was my memorial, my way of owning the experience, turning the terrifying scene of the crime into a place of quiet refuge and peace. I called it the anomaly, after his own words about me, the person who defied his calculations. I was wiping down the counter one rainy, melancholic afternoon, the only customer being a quiet man, reading a thick novel in the corner booth, when the bell above the door jingled, announcing a new presence, and a stranger walked in. He was young, maybe early 30s, handsome in a quiet, unassuming way, wearing a simple tailored wool coat. But what instantly struck me was his familiar aura, that same intense stillness, that commanding yet gentle presence that I knew better than my own name, though his face was subtly different, gentler, less angular than I remembered, his hair slightly longer and lighter, his demeanor softer. I froze, the cleaning cloth clutched tightly in my hand, my heart giving that old, familiar, terrifying lurch, and I knew instinctively, profoundly, before he even spoke a single word, that it was him. He walked up to the bar, not looking at me directly at first, but studying the simple menu board, and there was a subtle stiffness in his movement, a guardedness that was still deeply, painfully familiar, despite the gentler face. I managed to ask, my voice a shaky, dry croak. "What can I get for you today, sir?" He finally looked up, and his smile, though softer, less practiced and far more genuine than the cold curve I remembered, was undeniably immediately his, and he leaned in slightly across the dark granite counter, His voice that same low, smooth rumble that had once been cold as steel, but was now warm and comforting as aged brandy. "Coffee for the wrong guy," he murmured, the old dangerous joke now repurposed into a tender, whispered confession that spoke volumes of their shared history. I almost collapsed right there, tears stinging my eyes, recognizing the deep, weary, profound affection hidden behind his simple, loaded question. I prepared his coffee meticulously, my hands still shaking with shock and relief, and served it to him in a thick, simple ceramic mug. And he took it, his fingers brushing mine in a deliberate, meaningful contact that confirmed everything my heart already knew about his survival and his return. That night, after he had finished his coffee and left, leaving the exact change and not a word more than his question, I found the final, undeniable evidence, the proof I needed to confirm I wasn't hallucinating from stress or grief. I was methodically washing the mugs, and on the bottom of the heavy ceramic one he had used, barely visible under the glaze, was a small, perfectly carved, indelible set of initials, DM. But it wasn't just the initials which were new. Right next to them, faintly etched into the ceramic, was the precise, distinct, ghosted imprint of lips, a tiny, deliberate dark red stain of my lipstick, a poignant remnant of the kiss he had never forgotten or let go of. He was alive. He had faked his death to the world, erasing his entire mafia identity, going through unbelievable lengths to buy a new clean life with me, trading raw, absolute power for quiet, tentative peace, a life that was wrong by fate but right by heart. My heart soared with an almost agonizing lightness, but the danger of his past, that old familiar dread, still coiled instantly in my gut, reminding me sharply that true freedom never comes without a terrible, painful price, especially when dealing with the kind of powerful, relentless demons that Damien had tried so desperately to outrun. The peace we had built, that quiet, tentative, and utterly illicit happiness we had started to share in the anonymity of the small cafe, was brutally short-lived, shattering completely less than 6 months after his return. Giovanni Rossi, the rival mafia boss, the one who had always sought ruthlessly to destroy the Moretti Empire, eventually discovered that Damien was still alive, using his new face and his new gentle life to hide in plain sight and escape justice. Giovanni didn't come directly for Damien. He came with vicious calculation for me, kidnapping me from the cafe late one night, a final, brutal, vicious attempt to lure Damien out of the shadows and finish the job that the sniper had missed so long ago. I was taken to a dark, remote, familiar warehouse, tied to a cold metal chair again. And this time, the fear was paralyzing, knowing with sickening certainty that my fierce, consuming love for him had directly caused this final, fatal danger. Giovanni stood over me, cruel and gloating, the air thick with menace and the smell of stale cigarette smoke, and he had his men send a simple, untraceable, chilling message to Damien. "We have the painter. Come home to die." Damien came instantly, of course, exactly as Giovanni intended. He walked into that sterile, cold warehouse alone, without a visible weapon, without backup. His face calm, serene, and devoid of all expression, but his eyes were filled with a desperate, terrible fury and a profound pain I had never seen before. He saw me tied up, and for a split second, the mask he had perfected over decades slipped completely, revealing a look of pure, agonizing defeat, knowing he had utterly failed to protect the one thing he cared about and had risked everything for. He had built this new life, this gentle, quiet existence, but he was willing to surrender every single piece of it, every single quiet morning and soft whisper, just to keep me safe and breathing. Giovanni laughed, a harsh, grating, victorious sound that echoed cruelly in the vast emptiness of the warehouse, mocking the man who had traded an empire for a coffee shop and a mural artist. "Mafia can't love Moretti," Giovanni sneered, circling Damien like a triumphant hawk. "It only kills, exploits, and destroys. You should have known that. You should have let the little artist die that night and spared yourself this humiliation." Damien slowly, deliberately fell to his knees on the cold concrete floor, a complete and total act of submission. His head bowed low, his voice low and steady, not begging for mercy, but stating a final, irrevocable term that shook the warehouse. "Then kill me, Giovanni," he said, his eyes finally lifting to meet the rival's cold, calculating gaze, the look in them, not fear but pure defiance. "Kill me and take all the power, take all the business back, But you must let her go now immediately." Giovanni didn't hesitate for a second. He raised his gun, a heavy silver-plated weapon, glinting in the dim light, and aimed it straight and definitively at Damien's forehead, the final inevitable act of revenge and power about to play out. The shot rang out deafening and jarring in the enclosed space, the noise echoing painfully, but it didn't hit Damien. In that single desperate moment, fueled by a fierce protective love that transcended fear, pain, and all logic, I lunged forward with a primal cry still tied painfully to the metal chair, throwing my torso as far as I could manage, twisting my body desperately, making myself the only target, the one who would take the bullet intended for him. The impact was a fiery, blinding, agonizing pain, like a hammer striking directly into my chest, and I felt myself instantly slump forward, the heavy metal chair tipping violently over, crashing with a loud metallic clatter onto the concrete floor. And I could feel the warm, gushing wetness bloom instantly across the front of my shirt. My blood, dark and viscous, stained the front of Damien's beautiful white shirt as he scrambled frantically forward, tearing at the ropes that bound me to the broken chair, his large, capable hands trembling completely uncontrollably, and his eyes, those cold, controlled eyes, were now blazing with a desperate, insane terror, realizing the ultimate, terrifying sacrifice I had just made for him. He held me tightly, pressing his hands fiercely against the wound in a futile attempt to stem the flow, his face buried deep in my blood-soaked hair, his powerful body shaking with a violent, consuming, protective rage, and he pressed his lips against my temple, whispering promises that were heavy with the unbearable finality of that moment. No empire, no lies, just us, Sienna. Just us forever. In that moment of agonizing clarity and near death lying broken in his arms, I knew I had made the only choice that mattered. I had chosen fierce freedom, chosen impossible love, chosen him over the safe, meaningless life the world wanted for me. Damien, fueled by a cold, surgical fury I couldn't have imagined, stood up, pulling his own small, hidden weapon from its holster on his ankle, and in a terrifying, silent whirlwind of controlled violence, he eliminated Giovanni and his closest men, his single, final act of defense, not for his power, but for my life and our future. As the sirens of the approaching police, alerted by a prepared call from Clara, screamed closer and closer, their noise echoing through the night, Damien looked down at my bleeding body, and then slowly at the devastating scene around us, and made his last, definitive choice. The ultimate act of redemption. He dropped his gun to the floor and pulled out a stack of pristine documents, the entire complete evidence of his criminal organization he had been gathering for a year, and laid it gently on the concrete floor for the FBI to find. He turned back to me, cradling me tenderly against his chest, his eyes shining with a potent mixture of pain, profound love, and absolute relief. He was surrendering his freedom for my future, trading his life and his anonymity to ensure that the secrets of his past never came back to haunt us again. As the police burst through the doors, blinding us with their harsh flashlights, he simply smiled, a genuine, heartbreaking smile that finally reached the depths of his eyes, and he whispered the words that closed the circle, the words that defined our entire chaotic, beautiful story. "You kissed the wrong guy, but you made him right." A year later, I stood completely still in the bright, quiet, and strangely peaceful gallery space, surrounded by people who were looking at my art, not with mockery or judgment, but with genuine admiration and thoughtful respect. My new exhibition was titled simply, "The Kiss That Changed a Monster," a series of large, expressive pieces chronicling the dark beauty of redemption. I was completely recovered, the bullet wound a faint white line across my skin, a constant physical reminder of the price of our love and my sacrifice. Damien, after turning over the damning evidence and testifying, had faced the full music of his past, trading his testimony for a shortened sentence, finally achieving the official legal redemption he had fought so hard for, and he was due home soon, very soon. I was looking intently at the centerpiece of the exhibition, a painting of a dark, stormy city street, with one single luminous small cafe window glowing warmly, when I felt a familiar, powerful presence behind me, a deep warmth and stillness that I knew instantly, profoundly. I didn't turn around, not yet. A man in a simple black suit and a low-brimmed hat stepped quietly out of the shadows of the crowd, his posture familiar, his scent undeniably his, and he leaned in close, his voice a low melodic whisper that immediately tickled my ear and raised the fine hairs on my arms. "Still kissing wrong guy's sweetheart? Where are you watching from?" Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.